I'm going to be starting Titan Bear SLAMS as my league starter for Path of Exile 2's 0.4 update, and in this video I'll be going over the basic idea of that build. So over here on Mobalytics I've actually created a build guide with some kind of rough outlines for what I want to do. There's some descriptions here for how the new skills actually work and how I'm going to utilize them in the build, and you can actually use these links here to scroll down and get a bit of a screenshot here to see exactly how those skills actually work. But basically, this build is going to be using Titan for the Druid kind of loadout of Bear SLAMS. And the first question there is going to be, for most people, why Titan over Druid? So the main thing here is that Titan has Hulking Form, and Hulking Form is a notable that grants 50% increased effect of small passives. This wasn't nerfed again in the most recent patch, and this is just extremely strong as a notable. It's probably one of the strongest Ascendancy notables in the entire game. And the main reason here this is so good for SLAM skills in particular is the access to a higher magnitude of increased area of effects from the passive tree for those SLAM skills. The main skill that we're going to be utilizing in this build is basically a slam from the bear, and one kind of shockwave comes from each of the bear's paws for a total of 2 hits, and it has a pretty big area of effect. The base area of effect, the shockwave radius, is 3 meters there when it's in rage, which means that it's spent rage. And we're always going to be spending rage with this skill because we're going to constantly be generating it. And the Titan is going to be able to get the most area of effect scaling due to Hulking Form from the passive tree and all those area of effect nodes. However, there's something else there with Hulking Form, and that's that there's a big unknown right now in terms of the passive tree and what's going to be available in the strength int area of the tree. And Hulking Form means that the Titan is going to be making the best use of those nodes out of any class. Now, the other thing about Titan is the other half of the Ascendancy, because that is 4 out of your 8 points spent to get Hulking Form. The other part is all about SLAM things on the Titan. You have 2 different branches that are both about SLAMs, but I'm really interested in one particular branch in this patch, because Titan got a big change in this update, and it's in regards to the Crushing Impacts branch. So if we scroll down here and take a look at the Ascendancy right here, Crushing Impacts in the current patch is your hits are crushing blows, which essentially means that when you get a target into primed for stun, you can then actually immediately proceed to the heavy stun with the next hit. And that is quite good to be able to stun targets very quickly. This kind of acts as a good defensive node. But in the current patch, you have to spend 4 Ascendancy points to get this first node and the second node behind it, which is the kind of follow-up as you gain some damage. But this 50% more damage here is a very high damage multiplier, but it's barely ever up, because it requires a heavy stun, and you're not heavy stunning bosses all too often. But in patch 0.4, this is being changed. Instead, this damage multiplier here is being halved to 25% more, and then it's being moved onto the Crushing Impacts node. So you'll gain that kind of defensive benefit and the offensive benefit all rolled into one node. That makes this node quite a bit better than it was before. But the important thing here is the node that comes after this. This is a new node called Mountain Splitter. Now, when this was first added in the patch notes on day 1 of the patch note reveal, this is what it looked like. It said that SLAMs that you use yourself, or the third SLAM I should say, every third SLAM, that doesn't create fissures, causes 1 additional aftershock ahead and to each side of the initial area, and obviously it requires Crushing Impact, so it comes off of that node. But this would mean a total 3 aftershocks from every third SLAM, 1 to the left, 1 to the right, and 1 just ahead of you. But this was actually updated in the patch notes, and this now says it causes 3 additional aftershocks ahead and to each side of the initial area. That must mean that it's creating a total 9 aftershocks on every third SLAM skill, which sounds completely ridiculous when you consider that there's actually quite a lot of area of effect scaling specifically for aftershocks, and as I already mentioned, Titan can get a lot of attack area of effect scaling. And you may be thinking that that's just a wording change to, say, 3 total aftershocks, 1 on each side and 1 in front. But we actually have a support gem right here, a new support gem called Tectonic SLAMS, and it says that it causes skills to create 1 additional aftershock ahead and to each side. This is the same wording, and that's 1 additional. So unless this is also going to be updated for that new wording, which I don't think that's the case, this is actually creating a total of 9 aftershocks. And I already mentioned that Titan can get a bunch of extra area of effect due to Hulking Form, but you can also get nodes like this one right here, for example, which is Aftershocks, 30% increased area effect of Aftershocks you create yourself. So this is just a huge area effect scaling for Aftershocks specifically, and there's a potential there that you can have all of these Aftershocks overlapping, But Mountain Splitter is kind of the big question mark right now as to exactly how this is going to work. And there's always the fallback plan there of, instead of going for this branch here where we go into, Crushing Impacts and Mountain Splitter, we instead go for the tried and true Earthbreaker for additional Aftershock chance there for the slams that we're going to be using. And then there's always Mysterious Lineage there as well, which is just a good defensive node for life-based setups. But at least to begin with, I am going to be testing out that new Mountain Splitter node. Now let's move on to the bear stuff and how I'm going to be playing this build. So we have the basic Maul attack, which is the thing that's granted. It's like the basic attack that comes from the talisman, where you have to actually select which form you want. And we're going to be selecting bear form so that we can get Maul. And Maul is basically an attack that grants rage, it generates rage, it's 5 rage on hit, and notably about this attack is that it's kind of nice in the early game that it's more of a sweeping attack rather than being focused on one single target. It can hit multiple targets, but you'll be gaining 5 rage from that, and then you can kind of use this attack twice, and then follow up with a Furious Slam. Now, Furious Slam as an attack is a slam ability that hits twice. So when the bear kind of comes down from standing up and lands on all fours, it's going to create a shockwave from each of those front paws, and they're going to kind of overlap for a double hit. And this skill can be used at any time, but it can spend 10 rage if you have 10 rage, and it will become enraged, and you'll gain a bunch of extra damage. This works out to being about 50 or 60% more damage, I think. And there's also a higher amount of base shockwave radius here. It goes from 2 meters base radius to 3 if it's enraged. And there's also jagged ground being created. So once jagged ground is actually being created there, we're going to be able to use that for even more extra damage from Shockwave Totem. We'll talk about Shockwave Totem a bit more in a moment. But this is the kind of basic setup for the early game. We're just going to be hitting with Maul to gain rage, and then spending that rage with Furious Slam. That's the kind of basic loop there. Now, once we actually unlock it, we'll be grabbing Pounce. I think you need to be about level 5 or something, and you'll be able to grab Pounce. And Pounce is a wolf ability, and you may be thinking, well, that's weird, we're playing bear, but there's a wolf ability here. Well, the way our transforms are going to work in Path of Exile 2 is that even though you select your transform on the talisman, that only grants access to the basic transform attack. It doesn't lock you out of becoming another transform. And when you go from one transform to another, or when you go from human to a transform, or transform to human, there's no delay timer there or anything like that. There's sometimes a little bit of added base attack time on some of the skills when transforming, but for Pounce here, this is how this skill works. So this is a wolf ability. Notably, this is also a slam, and it's an attack. So we're going to transform into a werewolf, and then we leap to the target destination, and it creates a slam attack there. There's no kind of damage conversion on this, so we're dealing mostly physical damage. And this skill is basically going to land, and then it's going to deal a large kind of slam hit where you land, and then it's going to mark the highest rarity enemy. And the highest rarity enemy is going to be marked baseline with Predator's Mark. You can actually socket another mark skill in here, which is something we might want to play around with in the late game version of this build if we end up going crit or something like that. But Predator's Mark is actually pretty good. It makes targets take increased damage. If it's just us, it's going to be 3% increased damage there. But on top of what this mark does with the increased damage, if it gets consumed by killing the target, we actually spawn some wolves, and these wolves get spawned. They're basically just minions. In the early game, they're going to be great for a bit of extra damage, and they're also going to provide more increased damage, because this mark basically makes the target take more increased damage based on how many enemies of the enemy there is. So enemies of the enemy being us as the bear and the summoned wolves. So they're just going to add to this counter here, and that's going to make the target take even more increased damage when they're marked. Then we have the Fury of the Mountain skill, which is a skill that you unlock a little bit later on. I believe this comes around in Acts 2. And Fury of the Mountain is a channeling skill, and basically this creates molten fissures. So those kind of red or orangey looking kind of cracks in the ground. And how this is going to work is this skill creates the fissures. You can create up to 12 fissures at once, but you're only going to need a few of them under the target. And then this actually generates rage on hit. But how the fissures work is when you hit them with another slam skill that's not Fury of the Mountain, they will be activated and they will aftershock and they'll hit again. So we'll be able to hit them with any number of our skills, because we have a bunch of slam skills. We have the Furious Slam ability, which is our basic attack. That's the one we're going to be using all the time for most of our damage. Then we have Pounce, which is also a slam skill. And we have Shockwave Totem. 3 different slam skills that are all going to be hitting on top of those molten fissures. and every single slam that actually hits there is going to be proccing the Fury of the Mountain to hit again. And the important thing about that is that this skill grants rage. So once we actually have Fury of the Mountain, we no longer need to use Maul, because we're going to be using Fury of the Mountain to generate our rage. And that means we can do a really cool thing here where we essentially create a rage feedback loop, whereby we create some molten fissures underneath the boss, and then we constantly use our slams on top of the boss to continuously proc those molten fissures. So we basically spam Furious Slam and we spam Pounce and things like this, and we never have to use those rage generating skills because we are constantly generating rage from the passive procs of molten fissures. Then there's a new Spirit Gem coming in there, which is Savage Fury. This one is basically, you gain this kind of stacking Fury mechanic here, which stacks up to 20, and then you can actually activate this skill again to use the buff, and it will last 1 second per Fury, so 20 seconds, and you'll gain more damage, increase attack speed, and increase movement speed, and you have to lose a percentage of life per second there. We don't know if this is going to scale up to quite a lot. We're not really sure about this skill too much. It looks really strong as it is right now on that level 4 gem, but we'll have to wait and see exactly how that pans out. I think we'll be able to deal with the life loss quite easily with regen and also leech. Because this build is going to be primarily dealing physical damage, leech is going to be really easy to get onto this build just through our gear. Now lastly, there is Ferocious Roar there for the new skills. This is basically a meta Warcry skill. It does do something in and of itself, so if we scroll down here we can see it can be used while in bear form. That's kind of the important thing about it. And it grants rage, and it actually makes the empowered attacks after that break armor. But we're not really interested in the Ferocious Roar portion. What we want to use this skill for is to be able to socket another Warcry in there to be able to benefit from that Warcry whilst we're in bear form. So we don't need to actually swap out of bear form. We're going to be able to put Seismic Cry in there, and we're going to gain these extra bonuses here for Seismic Cry. Seismic Cry is a skill that basically, if there's a heavy stun target near you, you can use Seismic Cry, and then it will empower the next attack to actually cause an aftershock. An aftershock is basically repeating the attack, so this is going to be like dealing double damage pretty much. And this is really good synergy along with the Titan's crushing impacts, because we have a much easier time actually getting to those heavy stuns. Now, something else that should be mentioned in this video is the buffs to baseline rage, specifically because this build uses a lot of kind of rage generation and rage spending, and in this patch, rage is getting a really strong baseline buff so that it's going to be much easier to move between packs without losing your rage. So now they've changed it so that whenever rage is spent, it's always 10 rage, and that actually means that they can add this kind of visual effect on your character. When you actually have more than 10 rage, you'll have that visual effect. For example, on the bear, it's like some runes glowing on the bear's back, and then you know that you'll actually be able to, spend that rage to empower the abilities. And the way rage works is that it's lost over time if you haven't taken damage or gained rage in the last 4 seconds there. Previously, this was 2 seconds, so that's already a big buff as the baseline kind of rage decay mechanic. But on top of that, it used to be 10 rage lost per second, and now it's going to be 5 rage. So essentially, you're going to be able to keep more of your rage, which means that as a result of this, you're going to end up with having max rage more often. Now, one of the other things going on with the bear there is that you're going to be able to constantly generate endurance charges, because the bear, as a kind of baseline buff to being in bear form, whenever you actually spend rage, you generate an endurance charge. So we're going to be constantly spending rage in this build, so we'll always have endurance charges, and that means that Seismic Cry isn't going to go on cooldown there, because you can expend an endurance charge to actually bypass the cooldown, and even though Seismic is going to be socketed into Ferocious Roar, this actually carries the same thing. You can see there, this skill cooldown can be bypassed by expending an endurance charge. Now, the tree that I've got here is extremely basic. This is, in the campaign, towards the end of the campaign, something like that. But what I've got going on here is a very basic loadout for how I'm going to be pathing for the early game, with a view to actually moving up towards the Druid area of the tree here, towards some of the new nodes. We don't actually know what a lot of the new nodes do, but we do know that there are nodes there for things like rage and things like melee damage, and all of the shape-shifting stuff is also in this area here. So I'm going to be pathing up there, and I'm going to be making the best use of hulking form to be able to get the most out of those new nodes. But this is kind of all I can do as of right now, and this is mostly going to be, melee damage coming through here at the start, grabbing the melee damage wheels here. Notably, the new talismans that we're using for shapeshifting, those count as two-handed martial weapons, so all of these nodes here work for two-handed weapons. And we're also going to be grabbing some like bonus life here with some stun threshold, and there's a node here for some more life and also a bit more chance there for slams you use yourself to cause aftershocks, which is kind of nice. And over here we also have a Warcry node for Warcry's empower and additional attack. And then one of the other things I'm doing there is some armor break stuff. I'll discuss that in a moment in the gems, but we've got some armor scaling here as well. A bit of extra strength for some life, and here's some like area effect and attack damage and skill speed and things like that. So that is just really basic at the moment. Now up in the gems here, I actually have a few placeholder things because they're not in Mobalytics just yet in the build crafter, but some of the gems are here with the kind of basic information that we have right now. So we've got Maul for the early game with rapid attacks for a bit more increased attack speed, and Rage as well, so that we can gain 10 Rage on each of those hits. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll probably be dropping Maul quite early, so this isn't going to be a thing for too long. Then there's the main ability there, which is Furious Slam. That's linked to Aftershock for a chance at extra Aftershocks there. There's also Close Combat for more damage, Heft for more maximum physical damage, and Rage Forge. This is going to be an interesting one to kind of play around with. I'm not convinced that this is going to be really good or whether it's going to be the best support gem, but I want to try it out a little bit. This is making skills consume 10 Rage, and we already know that this skill already consumes 10 Rage, so we're kind of double dipping a little bit there on the chance to not remove any Rage but still gain the benefits as though they had. And this will make the skill spend 20 Rage in total, so it might not be feasible really to actually do this. But I do think that in the end game, with the correct setup, with, you know, Shockwave Totem going, on top of the Molten Fissures, we're going to be able to gain a lot of Rage. There's going to be a huge amount of Rage generation, so this might end up being a really, really good support because it is 35% more damage. Then we have Leaping Claw, which is the placeholder for Pounce. And we have Mark for Death here, which is the armor break coming in there. Because this is actually a baked-in mark skill, we're going to be able to support it with Mark for Death. That makes any physical damage towards that target while they're marked actually break their armor. So we're going to be able to gain armor break from that. And that basically means that the target is not going to have any physical damage reduction from their armor, but on top of that, they also take 20% increased physical hit damage from having fully broken armor. There's also Rage there, again, for more Rage generation. Then there's Shockwave Totem with rapid attacks and urgent totems to spawn that totem faster. The Shockwave Totem is actually going to be exceptionally good in this build because it's not only proccing those Molten Fissures to generate Rage for us, but it's also exploding the jagged ground from Furious Slam, so that is a really, really nice pickup for this build. Then we have Flame Slice here, which is actually the placeholder for Fury of the Mountain. And this is basically the one that creates those Molten Fissures. Again, we've got Rage there for even more Rage generation. Fist of War, so again, Ancestry boosted attack. It has more area effect and a bit more damage. And then there's Burgeon, because this is actually a channeling skill. So if we channel this for 2 seconds, we can get that maximum 40% more for the full duration of those Molten Fissures and every Aftershock that they create thereafter. That's a really strong support gem. Then there's Meta Range Attack on Freeze. This is the placeholder here for Ferocious Roar, which is socketed with Seismic Cry. Then there's Tireless, which basically grants a chance that the empowered attack isn't spent, which is quite nice. There's also Raging Cry there for even more Rage generation. Then there's Overwhelming Presence, which means we can get to those stuns faster. And lastly, we have Dominating Aura, which is a placeholder for that Savage Fury, which is, you know, the bonus damage buff. Then for the gear, I haven't actually filled this out, but this is going to be really basic. It's going to be a talisman there, obviously, for the bear, which is going to be mostly focused on physical damage. If you can, any kind of added elemental damage in the campaign is going to be just fine. But if you can focus on it, increase physical damage, flat physical damage, attack speed, and skill gems, they're the main modifiers that you want to focus on. And then the rest of the gear is pretty much just life, resistance, armor gear. Try to focus on getting movement speed on your boots and getting your resistances capped and things like that. Any kind of life regen and stuff like that is also a nice bonus. But that is pretty much it. That's the basic overview for the build that I want to do in 0.4. Kind of looking forward to playing around with the bear slams. They look really fun. The Ziggy D footage is what sold me on this. I was a bit on the fence, you know, for the Druid stuff. And I still really am a bit on the fence when it comes to the Druid Ascendancies, especially since we just don't have the full information there. But I am pretty confident that Titan is going to be the best bear ascendancy, the go-to bear ascendancy, because those AoE nodes are just so good. Now, I plan to update this as and when we gain new information and as I progress. So as I actually progress and I start to, you know, change my build and mess around with different support gems and things like that, I'll be updating the build with all of the gear and things like that. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.